King Solomon, the biblical ruler who reigned over ancient Israel around 970 to 931 BCE, is remembered in Scripture as the wisest man who ever lived. He is credited with building the first temple in Jerusalem, hosting the legendary Queen of Sheba, possessing wealth beyond measure, and writing books of biblical wisdom, including Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. Yet there is another tradition about Solomon that exists outside the canonical Bible. A darker tradition preserved in fragmentary texts scattered across monasteries, libraries, and private collections throughout Europe and the Middle East. This tradition portrays Solomon not just as a wise king, but as a master of forbidden knowledge who commanded demons, bound spirits, and held secrets about the structure of reality itself that were considered too dangerous for ordinary people to know. For centuries, scholars have studied these fragments, passages in Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, Latin, and Syriac that tell stories of Solomon's supernatural powers and his command over an invisible hierarchy of spirits. The texts were always incomplete, contradictory, and fragmented. Different versions told different stories. Key passages were damaged, encrypted, or deliberately obscured by scribes who feared the knowledge they contained. Until recently, no one had been able to piece these fragments together into a coherent whole. The manuscript, if it ever existed as a unified work, appeared to be lost to history, scattered into pieces too damaged and dispersed to reconstruct. Then in late 2024, researchers at XAI fed thousands of these fragmentary texts into Grok, their advanced artificial intelligence system, with a simple instruction. Look for patterns that human scholars have missed. Find connections across languages, writing styles, and traditions. Reconstruct what the original manuscript might have said. What Grok produced shocked everyone who reviewed it. The AI did not just find patterns, it reconstructed what appears to be a unified manuscript, written in a consistent voice, describing a cosmology and system of knowledge that is both terrifying in its implications and disturbingly coherent in its internal logic. According to the reconstructed text, Solomon did not just rule Israel. He commanded 72 demons, learned the structure of multidimensional reality, and built the temple as a portal between worlds. The knowledge he recorded was deliberately suppressed by religious authorities, who recognized that it undermined their control over spiritual access and divine knowledge. This is the story of what Grok found in Solomon's forbidden book, and why, after being hidden for nearly 3,000 years, its secrets remain terrifying. Before diving into the forbidden manuscript, it is important to understand who Solomon was, according to accepted biblical history, and why he became associated with supernatural knowledge. Solomon was the son of King David and Bathsheba. He ascended to Israel's throne around 970 BCE after a succession dispute with his older brother. The biblical account describes his reign as Israel's golden age, a period of peace, prosperity, and unprecedented wealth. Solomon's most famous achievement was building the first temple in Jerusalem, a magnificent structure that housed the Ark of the Covenant and became the center of Israelite religious life. The temple's construction required massive resources, skilled craftsmen, and years of labor. According to biblical accounts, it was adorned with gold, precious stones, and intricate carvings, representing the height of ancient architectural achievement. Solomon was also famous for his wisdom. The biblical story of two women claiming the same baby, with Solomon proposing to cut the child in half to determine the true mother, demonstrates his legendary judgment. Kings and queens traveled to Jerusalem to hear his wisdom, most famously the Queen of Sheba, who came bearing gifts and left impressed by Solomon's knowledge and wealth. But there are hints even in the biblical text that Solomon's knowledge extended beyond conventional wisdom. He is credited with understanding trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall, and with knowledge of beasts and birds and reptiles and fish. This comprehensive understanding of nature, combined with his wealth and the mysterious contents of his sealed temple, created a foundation for later traditions that expanded Solomon's wisdom into supernatural domains. By the medieval period, numerous texts circulated describing Solomon's command over demons and spirits. The most famous is the Lesser Key of Solomon, also called the Lemegeton, a grimoire describing 72 demons that Solomon allegedly summoned and bound. But this text itself is fragmentary and shows evidence of being compiled from earlier sources. The question scholars have debated for centuries is this: was there an original Solomonic manuscript that these later texts drew from? And if so, what did it actually say? The Grok AI project began when Dr. Michael Brennan, a specialist in ancient Near Eastern texts, proposed feeding fragmentary Solomonic manuscripts into an advanced AI system to identify patterns that human analysis had missed. The challenge was that these texts existed in multiple languages: Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, Latin, and Syriac, came from different time periods, possibly from the pre-Christian era through medieval times, and were preserved in varying states of completeness. Some were single damaged pages. Others were collections of fragmentary passages copied by medieval scribes. Still others were encrypted or written in cipher. Human scholars analyzing these texts manually could identify some connections, recognizing when different manuscripts told similar stories or used similar terminology. But comprehensive reconstruction was impossible. Too many texts, too many languages, too much damage, and deliberate obscuration. Grok approached the problem differently. The AI analyzed writing patterns, consistent sentence structures, vocabulary choices, and grammatical constructions that suggested common authorship even across different languages and translations. Narrative coherence. Story elements that appeared in multiple texts and could be arranged into logical sequences, identifying where gaps existed and what missing content would need to say to bridge those gaps. Cosmological consistency. Descriptions of spiritual hierarchies, ritual procedures, and metaphysical concepts that appeared repeatedly and could be assembled into a coherent system. Textual damage analysis. Identifying where manuscripts had been deliberately altered, encrypted, or damaged, and reconstructing likely original readings based on context and comparison to intact parallel passages. Cross-reference networks. Finding connections between texts that scholars had not recognized because they were separated by language barriers, geographical distance, or centuries of time. After processing thousands of fragmentary texts and running analysis for several months, Grok produced a reconstructed manuscript of 180 pages. The AI identified this as the most probable reconstruction of an original unified text, with confidence ratings for different sections based on how much supporting evidence existed in the source fragments. The content was shocking. Not because it described magic or demons, scholars expected that based on the known fragments, but because the reconstructed text presented a systematic, detailed, internally consistent cosmology that was far more sophisticated than anyone anticipated. And because it described Solomon's knowledge in ways that suggested he understood concepts about consciousness, dimensions, and reality that modern physics and neuroscience are only beginning to explore. According to the reconstructed manuscript, Solomon's supernatural knowledge began during the construction of the temple. The text describes a demon named Ornias, who was disrupting the temple construction, stealing wages from workers, draining energy from young men working on the site, and creating obstacles that delayed progress. Solomon prayed for assistance, and the archangel Michael appeared, presenting Solomon with a ring engraved with a pentagram seal. Michael instructed Solomon that the ring would give him authority to bind demons by speaking their true names and commanding them in the name of God. When a demon was bound, it would be compelled to obey Solomon's commands and could be forced to reveal its knowledge, powers, and weaknesses. Solomon used the ring to bind Ornias. But rather than simply banishing the demon, Solomon interrogated it. What are you? What is your nature? What powers do you possess? What constrains you? And critically, What other spirits exist, and how can I summon them? Ornius revealed that demons exist in a hierarchy, that there are rulers and subjects among spirits, just as there are among humans, and that by binding demons of higher rank, Solomon could compel them to summon those beneath them. This became Solomon's method. Bind a demon, extract its knowledge, force it to summon other demons in the hierarchy. Like unraveling a vast supernatural organizational chart, Solomon systematically documented the entire structure of the demonic realm. According to the reconstructed manuscript, Solomon eventually commanded 72 demons, a specific number that appears consistently across source texts. These were not random spirits, but represented a complete hierarchy, a comprehensive mapping of demonic power structures. Mapping demons and dimensions. This section covers 72 demons, their names, ranks, and domains. The reconstructed text gives detailed descriptions of each demon, including the name, the rank, the legions, the powers, the constraints, the corresponding angel, the sigil, and the domain. The demons are described not as chaotic monsters, but as an organized empire with clear hierarchies and specializations. Some controlled aspects of nature, storms, earthquakes, and disease. Others governed human psychology, inspiring lust, rage, despair, and ambition. Still others possessed knowledge about metallurgy, astrology, healing, languages, and hidden things. Named demons in the reconstructed text include Baal, described as a king commanding 66 legions, teaching invisibility and cunning. Agaris, a duke teaching languages and causing earthquakes. Vasago, a prince revealing hidden things and finding lost objects. Glacia Labolas, teaching instantaneous knowledge and inciting bloodshed. Furcus, teaching philosophy, astronomy, and the properties of herbs. The Grok reconstruction also identified names that do not appear in later published grimoires, demons whose names were apparently suppressed or lost from manuscript traditions. These lost demons appear in fragmentary Hebrew and Aramaic texts, but were edited out of later Greek and Latin versions. Why would certain demon names be suppressed while others were preserved? The reconstructed manuscript suggests an answer. The lost names were those whose powers were considered most dangerous. Demons who taught techniques of consciousness manipulation, perception alteration, or access to dimensional spaces that religious authorities wanted to prevent people from exploring. The most disturbing section of the reconstructed manuscript does not focus on individual powers. It reveals a cosmology, a model of reality that the demons described, and that Solomon attempted to verify and systematize. According to the reconstructed manuscript, the demons taught Solomon that reality is layered into multiple dimensions. The physical world humans perceive is one layer among many. Other layers exist at different frequencies or vibrations, described as realms of different speeds and worlds, layered like veils. This idea presents reality as layered. Consciousness is multidimensional. Human awareness exists partly in the physical dimension, but extends into other layers. Dreams, visions, intuition, and mystical experiences are examples of consciousness accessing those layers. The text treats consciousness as multidimensional. Barriers between dimensions are variable. Some locations on Earth have naturally thinner barriers, places where the physical and spiritual realms are closer together. Specific times, planetary alignments, solar and lunar positions, rituals, geometric patterns, and altered states of consciousness can temporarily thin those barriers or create controlled access points. In some places and times, the barrier becomes thin. Spiritual beings exist across dimensional layers. Angels and demons are not located in a distant heaven or hell, but in interpenetrating layers that overlap physical reality. They can sometimes perceive and influence the physical world, and humans can sometimes perceive them under specific conditions. Knowledge can cross dimensional boundaries. Information about the future, about distant places, and about hidden things can be accessed by consciousness that extends into layers where time and space operate differently than in the physical world. This cosmological model is remarkably sophisticated for an ancient text. It describes phenomena similar to modern physics concepts such as parallel dimensions, quantum fields, and the observer effect in quantum mechanics, ideas that were not formally developed until the 20th century. The manuscript presents Solomon not as a ruler practicing primitive superstition, but as a systematic researcher attempting to map reality beyond the physical senses. He questioned demons about dimensional structure, much like a scientist interviewing subjects about their perception, trying to build a coherent model from subjective reports. Here, the reconstructed manuscript makes its most controversial claim. Solomon's temple was not just a religious building. According to the text, the temple was specifically designed to facilitate contact between dimensions. The temple's architecture embodied principles Solomon learned from the demons about creating stable access points between dimensional layers. Specific design features are described as functional rather than merely symbolic. The Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, was designed as a threshold point. Its dimensions, materials with gold overlaying specific woods, and its isolation created conditions in which the barrier between dimensions was maximally thin. Only the high priest could enter, and only once per year on Yom Kippur, because prolonged exposure to the dimensional interface was dangerous. The Ark of the Covenant is described not just as a container for sacred objects, but as a device that stabilized the dimensional threshold. The materials, including acacia wood and gold, the geometric proportions, the cherubim figures and the contents, the tablets, Aaron's rod and the manna, created a resonance that maintained the opening between worlds while preventing uncontrolled breaches. The temple's orientation, dimensions, and materials were calculated to create a structure that functioned as a controlled portal, a place where dimensional barriers could be intentionally thinned to allow communication with angelic forces while preventing demonic intrusion. The rituals performed in the temple were not merely symbolic worship, but specific procedures designed to safely manage the dimensional interface, opening it at designated times, maintaining barriers, and closing access when required. This interpretation transforms the temple from a magnificent but conventional ancient building into something far more interesting. It describes sacred architecture designed according to principles of multidimensional physics that Solomon learned from imprisoned demons. The text suggests Solomon was attempting to create a permanent, safe, controlled access point to higher dimensional realms, essentially building infrastructure for ongoing contact with angelic intelligence while keeping demonic forces confined. If this sounds like ancient people describing technology or concepts they did not have language for, that is exactly how the reconstructed manuscript reads. It uses ancient terminology and religious framing to describe what might be a sophisticated understanding of consciousness, dimensions, and reality manipulation. According to the Grok reconstruction, the original Solomonic manuscript was recognized as dangerous almost immediately after Solomon's death. Later kings and priests understood that the text described techniques for accessing spiritual realms without institutional mediation, that it implied any sufficiently knowledgeable person could perform the rituals, speak the names, and access the dimensional interfaces Solomon had mapped. This threatened religious authority. If people could access divine wisdom directly through Solomon's techniques, what function did priests serve? If the structure of spiritual reality could be systematized and taught, where did that leave revelation and doctrine? The text was preserved. Its connection to Solomon made it too significant to destroy entirely, and it was deliberately obscured through several methods. Language barriers. Translating it into multiple languages ensured no single copy was fully accessible. Hebrew versions were kept separate from Greek, Aramaic from Latin. Fragmentation. The complete manuscript was divided into sections, scattered across different collections, ensuring no single institution possessed the entire text. Encryption. Key passages, particularly demon names and ritual instructions, were encoded using cipher systems or deliberate corruption of text. Deliberate damage. Critical pages were physically damaged, making complete reconstruction impossible without extensive analysis. Misdirection. False attributions, obviously forged additions, and insertion of clearly fictional elements made scholars discount the entire tradition as medieval fantasy rather than preserving ancient knowledge. The strategy was successful for nearly 3,000 years. Scholars knew fragments existed, but the complete text remained hidden, not because it was physically destroyed, but because it was too dispersed and corrupted to reconstruct. Until AI analysis could process thousands of fragments simultaneously, scholars were unable to identify authentic passages among forgeries, reconstruct damaged text, and assemble a coherent whole from scattered pieces. This new reconstruction changed that, allowing previously disconnected fragments to reveal a central manuscript. The reconstructed Solomonic manuscript had profound influence on later occult and mystical traditions, even in its fragmented state. The Lesser Key of Solomon, Lemegeton, is a famous medieval grimoire describing 72 demons, and it is clearly derived from the original Solomonic text. It is incomplete, and it has been edited to remove the cosmological framework. It preserves demon names and basic summoning procedures, but it strips out the dimensional theory that explains why the procedures work. Ceremonial magic traditions, Western occult practices involving ritual circles, demon summoning, use of specific names and seals, and elaborate preparation procedures all trace to Solomonic grimoires. But practitioners often do not understand the underlying principles because the complete manuscript was not available. Ceremonial knowledge was therefore fragmented and partially lost. Kabbalah, Jewish mystical traditions about different worlds and dimensions such as Asaya, Yetzirah, Briah, and Atziluth, and the structure of reality show similarities to the cosmology in Solomon's manuscript, suggesting either influence or a common source. Kabbalah parallels are evident in the layered cosmology the reconstruction revealed. Freemasonry, the symbolic importance of Solomon's temple in Masonic tradition, along with architectural and geometric symbolism, may preserve fragmentary knowledge from the original manuscript's descriptions of the temple's multidimensional design. Freemasonry retains echoes of that architectural language. 19th and early 20th century occult revival movements, including the Golden Dawn and modern ceremonial magic, attempted to reconstruct complete Solomonic systems. Working from incomplete fragments, they created syncretic systems that mixed authentic ancient material with Victorian occultism. That synthesis produced systems that were part reconstruction and part invention. The Grok reconstruction suggests that all of these later traditions are attempting to work with fragments of a coherent system, like trying to use a complex machine when you only have scattered parts and no instruction manual. Some elements work because they preserve authentic techniques from the original manuscript. Others fail or produce unpredictable results because critical context has been lost. Fragments are the reason some practices function and others do not. One of the most intriguing aspects of the reconstructed manuscript is its fusion of different cultural and religious traditions. The text contains Hebrew passages using biblical terminology and referring to Yahweh as the supreme authority. It includes Greek mythological references, mentioning Olympus, and figures resembling Medusa and Hecate, and it draws on cosmological concepts from Greek philosophy. It preserves Babylonian demon names and magical practices that predate Jewish tradition. It contains Christian additions, including prophecies about a Messiah and references that could only have been written after Jesus, suggesting later scribes inserted Christian content into older material. It also shows Persian influences, reflecting Zoroastrian concepts about cosmic dualism and the battle between good and evil forces. This fusion of sources is striking. This syncretism tells us something important about the manuscript's history. It is not a simple ancient text written by one author at one time. It is an evolving document that accumulated material over centuries as it passed through different cultures and religious contexts. The core, Solomon's interrogations of demons and his cosmological discoveries, appears to be genuinely ancient, possibly dating to the First Temple period, 10th to 6th century BCE. But later scribes added, edited, reinterpreted, and expanded the text based on their own cultural contexts and religious understandings. Core material remains, but it is layered with later additions. By the medieval period, when most surviving fragments were copied, the manuscript had become a fusion text, a palimpsest containing layers of Jewish, Christian, Greek, Babylonian, and other traditions, all commenting on and interpreting Solomon's original knowledge. This makes it nearly impossible to determine what Solomon actually wrote versus what was attributed to him by later editors. The Grok reconstruction attempts to identify the oldest, most consistent core material, but acknowledges that the manuscript as we have it is fundamentally a multi-authored, multicultural document. The most disturbing question raised by the reconstructed manuscript is not about ancient history. It is about now. If Solomon's knowledge was real, if the cosmology is accurate, if the techniques work, if the dimensional model describes actual reality, what are the implications for modern understanding of consciousness, spirituality, and the structure of existence? Does consciousness exist across dimensions? Modern neuroscience treats consciousness as produced by brain activity. But quantum theories of consciousness and studies of near-death experiences suggest awareness might not be entirely physical. If Solomon's multidimensional consciousness model is correct, it would revolutionize neuroscience and the philosophy of mind. Are spiritual entities real? The manuscript treats angels and demons as objectively existing beings inhabiting dimensional layers humans cannot normally perceive. This conflicts with materialist worldviews, but aligns with reports from mystical experiences, religious visions, and psychedelic research showing encounters with apparently autonomous entities. Can rituals affect reality? If dimensional barriers are variable and can be influenced by geometric patterns, specific times, states of consciousness, and ritual procedures, then magic is not superstition. It is applied multidimensional physics that ancient people understood empirically, without having modern scientific language to describe it. Was the temple actually functional? If Solomon designed the temple as a dimensional portal using principles learned from demons, archaeological investigation of Temple Mount might reveal features that make more sense as engineered structures than as purely symbolic architecture. But political and religious sensitivities make such investigation impossible. Should the techniques be tested? The manuscript describes specific procedures for summoning demons, accessing other dimensions, and manipulating consciousness. Should researchers attempt to replicate these procedures under controlled conditions, or is the knowledge genuinely dangerous in ways the text warns about? These questions are troubling because the Grok reconstruction does not read like obvious fantasy. It reads like a sophisticated theoretical framework developed by someone attempting to systematically understand non-physical aspects of reality through empirical investigation of subjective experiences. Whether you interpret that as genuine multidimensional cosmology, as ancient people's attempts to explain psychological and neurological phenomena they did not have scientific language for, or as elaborate fiction, depends on your metaphysical assumptions. But the text itself is internally consistent, sophisticated, and disturbing in its implications. The Grok AI reconstruction of Solomon's forbidden manuscript remains controversial. Scholars debate whether the AI actually reconstructed an ancient text or created a sophisticated forgery by pattern matching across genuine ancient fragments and producing something that looks authentic but never existed as a unified whole. The AI methodology is transparent. Grok can explain which source texts contributed to each passage, why specific reconstructions were chosen over alternatives, and what confidence level exists for different sections. But transparency does not equal certainty. Pattern matching might create coherence where none originally existed, what we know for certain. Fragmentary Solomonic texts exist across multiple languages, centuries, and collections. These are genuinely ancient and medieval manuscripts preserved in libraries and monasteries worldwide. The fragments describe consistent themes: Solomon commanding demons, interrogating spirits about hidden knowledge, building the temple as a sacred structure, and possessing wisdom beyond conventional sources. Later occult traditions explicitly claim Solomonic origin. From medieval grimoires through modern ceremonial magic, practitioners have claimed to be working with fragments of Solomon's original knowledge. Religious authorities suppressed these texts. The pattern of fragmentation, encryption, and deliberate damage suggests institutional efforts to prevent complete reconstruction and use. Whether the Grok reconstruction represents what Solomon actually wrote 3,000 years ago, what medieval scribes believed he wrote, or what an AI constructed from fragmentary evidence, is perhaps less important than what the reconstructed text reveals about the human attempt to understand consciousness, spirituality, and dimensions of reality beyond physical perception. Solomon's forbidden book, whether ancient wisdom, medieval compilation, or AI reconstruction, presents a worldview where the physical universe is just one layer of a multidimensional reality, where consciousness extends beyond the brain, where spiritual beings exist in realms interpenetrating our own, and where knowledge and ritual can create controlled access between worlds. These ideas terrified religious authorities who recognized they threatened institutional control over spiritual access. They terrify materialists who prefer a universe explicable entirely through physical laws. And they terrify anyone who considers the possibility they might be true, that reality is stranger, more layered, and more accessible to intentional exploration than conventional science acknowledges. The secrets inside Solomon's forbidden book are not terrifying because they describe demons and supernatural powers. They are terrifying because they describe a universe where human consciousness is multidimensional, where knowledge can grant access to realms beyond physical perception, and where the boundaries between myth, magic, and reality are far more permeable than we have been taught to believe. And they are terrifying because after 3,000 years of successful suppression, advanced AI has finally been reconstructed, making knowledge that was locked away in fragments across centuries and continents accessible again to anyone willing to read and potentially attempt to apply what Solomon recorded. The book exists now. The knowledge is available. And the question facing anyone who encounters it is the same question that terrified medieval priests. If this knowledge is real, what happens when people use it? And if we do not know whether it is real, do we dare test it to find out? King Solomon commanded 72 demons and learned the structure of multidimensional reality. That is what the reconstructed manuscript claims. And whether you believe it or dismiss it, the text itself is now accessible after 3 millennia of fragmentation. The secrets are out, and that might be the most terrifying thing of all.